Return of spontaneous circulation, or ROSC, is often seen as the finish line. Welcome to the explainer. I'm really excited to dive into this material with you today because, well, we're looking at a critical phase in emergency medicine that honestly gets deeply misunderstood. You know the feeling, right? A patient's heart is successfully restarted after an arrest and the whole medical team just naturally exhales. The monitor is finally showing an organized rhythm. It feels like a total rescue. But as the data and the guidelines we're going to unpack today show us, that moment is definitely not the end of the emergency. Yet, even though we want it to be the finish line, achieving ROSC actually fires the starting gun on a highly volatile physiological race. It's a race against a massive second wave of injury, specifically secondary brain injury and post-cardiac arrest syndrome. Think about it. The heart that just survived an arrest has been through the ringer, glomal ischemia, absolute metabolic chaos, and the literal mechanical stress of chest compressions. So what follows is this highly predictable pattern of myocardial dysfunction. The patient might look like they've crossed the finish line, but their physiology is actively working against them. Blood pressure drops, perfusion plummets, and the brain starts taking damage at the exact moment everyone in the room thought the crisis was over. So let's look at exactly how this physiological collapse happens. Normally, a healthy brain has this brilliant built-in safety mechanism. It's called cerebral autoregulation. Basically, it can maintain consistent, steady blood flow and perfusion, even when your blood pressure is wildly fluctuating. But the post-arrest brain, that's a completely different story. That amazing autoregulatory capacity is just entirely gone. The injured brain becomes 100% dependent on whatever blood pressure the systemic circulation can scrape together and deliver. And here's the truly terrifying part. If the systemic pressure drops, cerebral blood flow drops right along with it. It's a rigid one-to-one relationship, leaving the organ that is absolutely the most sensitive to falling perfusion completely defenseless. And that intense vulnerability brings us to a number you really need to keep in your head. It acts as an absolute lifeline. 65. Specifically, we're talking about a mean arterial pressure, or a MAP, of at least 65 millimeters of mercury. Current international guidelines strongly recommend targeting a MAP of at least 65 in the post-arrest period. Why? Because we have to optimize cerebral perfusion pressure. Dropping below this threshold, which is what we define as post-arrest hypertension, is independently associated with significantly worse neurological outcomes. You drop the MAP below 65, and you are literally directly dropping the blood flow to an already starving brain. Now, you might be wondering why this obsessive shift in focus from systolic blood pressure to mean arterial pressure. Well, it's actually pretty simple. A systolic reading of, say, 100 with a wide pulse pressure, it actually tells us very little about the continuous steady flow of blood that's actually reaching the brain. MAP, on the other hand, gives you this single, highly reliable number that reflects the true driving pressure throughout the entire cardiac cycle. It is hands down the much more accurate indicator of actual organ perfusion pressure. Okay, so we know the target. How do we actually treat this post-arrest hypotension? Well, the approach follows the exact same logical framework we use for any shocked patient. You identify the mechanism and then you treat it. If the patient is volume depleted, we start with cautious fluid resuscitation, usually using normal saline or balanced crystalloids. And I really want to emphasize that word, cautious. The post-arrest heart is often stunningly weak. It's really struggling with reduced contractility. If you go in and load up the patient with aggressive, rapid fluids, that struggling heart just cannot handle the preload. And if you do that, you run a massive risk of worsening or even causing pulmonary edema. So when fluid resuscitation just isn't enough to hit that target, we enter the kind of nuanced chess game of vasopressors. Norepinephrine is going to be your agent of choice for vasodilatory hypertension. It does exactly what we need. It increases systemic vascular resistance and pushes that MAP up, but without causing the really dangerous tachycardia that you get with adrenaline. Now, adrenaline and dopamine, while they are sometimes necessary, if there's clear evidence of extremely low cardiac output, they are huge double-edged swords. They come with a massive trade-off. They significantly increase myocardial oxygen demand and pile workload onto a heart that is already severely strained. The absolutely crucial point to remember here is that a vasopressor is a bridge. It is not the destination. Haemodynamic optimization has to run perfectly in parallel with identifying and treating the actual precipitating cause of the arrest itself. For example, if a patient arrested from a STEMI, they desperately need to get to the catheterization laboratory. Coronary reperfusion is a major hemodynamic intervention in its own right, or if they have a tension pneumothorax, they need needle decompression right away, you're simply buying time with vasopressors to get them to the actual definitive fix. Let's shift gears a bit and see how this all fits into the broader picture of post-arrest care, specifically when it comes to patient temperature. For nearly 20 years, we essentially lived in the era of the big chill. Based on two pretty small studies back in 2002, dropping a patient's body temperature way down to 32 to 34 degrees Celsius was considered the absolute global gold standard. Everyone thought it was this miracle neuroprotectant. But as it turns out, that huge scientific momentum was based on a pretty major flaw. Those early trials had significant limitations, like control groups that actually went on to develop harmful fevers. It took massive high-quality trials, specifically the TTM trial in 2013 and the TTM2 trial in 2021, to finally unravel this. They proved that actively freezing patients provided the exact same survival rates as simply preventing them from getting a fever in the first place. The realization from those trials was profound. The real enemy of the post-arrest brain was never the absence of being cold. No, it was the presence of toxic hypothermia. Fever dramatically increases cerebral metabolic demand at a time when the brain can literally least afford it. A brain that's running hot needs significantly more blood flow just to meet its basic metabolic needs. So think about it. Combine hypothermia with a low mean arterial pressure, and you have essentially engineered a perfect storm for secondary brain injury. And this is exactly what led to a total global transformation championed by ICLOR, the International Liaison Committee on Resuscitation. They completely threw out the aggressive cooling protocols and introduced a strategy simply called temperature control. The new guidelines are actually deceptively simple. First, actively prevent fever by keeping the core temperature at or below 37.5 degrees Celsius. You need to maintain this strict focus for at least 72 hours. And crucially, this is huge from a safety standpoint. Avoid the routine use of rapid cold IV fluids in the pre-hospital setting. We used to do that all the time, but we now know they can cause massive pulmonary edema or even trigger a recurrent cardiac arrest. Definitely not what you want. Now, of course, none of these concepts exist in a vacuum. Modern post-arrest management is really a triad of care, and all three elements have to be managed simultaneously. First, you have hemodynamics, securing that map of 65 or higher. Second, you have temperature control, keeping the brain cool and below 37.5 degrees to lower metabolic demand. And third, you have oxygen titration. Why titrate? Well, because a patient with a great map of 65, but an oxygen saturation sitting at 100% is actually actively being harmed by oxygen toxicity. You've got to carefully titrate that oxygen down to a 94 to 98% sweet spot, so you aren't literally poisoning the brain while you're trying to perfuse it. But here's the reality check. All of this highly technical care hits a very real, very human roadblock in the hospital. We call it the handover gap. This is the incredibly dangerous window of time between achieving ROSC in the emergency department and finally getting the patient fully admitted and stabilized up in the ICU. During this transit phase, responsibility is shared, monitoring is transitional, and it is remarkably easy, scarily easy, for the patient's blood pressure to quietly drift downward without anyone taking immediate action. And that right there is exactly where the secondary brain injury quietly happens, which brings us to the ultimate takeaway for this explainer. Achieving a heartbeat is an incredible medical feat, absolutely. But a map below 65 in a post-arrest patient is not just a number to watch and trend, it is a number you have to fix immediately. You must treat post-ROSC hypertension with the exact same aggressive urgency you used to treat the cardiac arrest itself. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. When the monitor finally shows a rhythm, are you just watching the patient or are you actively saving the brain? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating shift in resuscitation science with me today. Keep pushing for that optimal map, and I'll catch you next time at Life Support Institute.